Now, in this session, I want to expose how the culture of gender ideology is pursuing, indoctrinating, and really abusing, I'm going to call it what it is, abusing our children. To do this, we need to understand the two different types of gender dysphoria that threaten children. So I want to really zero in on that a little bit in this session. The first type is called child onset gender dysphoria, or COGD, and the second is called rapid onset dysphoria, or ROGD, which occurs mostly in adolescence. So we're going to look at both of those in this session. The first one, childhood onset gender dysphoria, or COGD. Some children, both boys and girls, exhibit gender, we could say, non-conforming behavior, and they do it from an early age. Gender nonconformity may express itself with strong preferences to behave like the other sex in regard to clothing, play styles, playmates, certain interests, and we could go on in different ways.
Y'all remember that movie, Remember the Titans? It's just one of my favorites, Denzel Washington. So Coach, in this movie, Coach, he was a single dad. He had a little girl named Cheryl. And Cheryl knew as much about football strategy as any man in the town. I mean, she knew it, and she loved it. But when the new coach moved into town, this is Denzel Washington, he moves into town. He has these two little girls, and they are very prissy little girls. They love dolls, and they paint their nails. And so they get together with Cheryl, and they think she is weird. That's what they tell their mom, weird. And Cheryl is an example of gender nonconformity. Why? Because she loved football, which was considered more masculine, and she would rather get with the coaches and watch film than she would get with these little girls and play dolls. And so she's, in her behavior and her preferences, that was being gender nonconforming. But she knew she was a girl, and there was never an issue made out of it. Now, she might have wished she was a boy sometimes so she could get out there and play football. And I mean, she would get out there and she would yell and scream at the refs with just as much vigor. Yeah, she knew as much as all the men in town. I mean, she knew it, but she loved it because her dad was a coach, and she didn't have a mother, so that was how she was brought up. No one ever questioned it. She was a girl, and there's nothing alarming about that either. Any of you ladies, were you ever considered tomboys? See, there's not a big deal with that, but that's considered gender nonconformity.
You might say, interestingly, does the Bible ever present a case like that where we see this? And actually it does. In Genesis chapter 25 and verses 24 through 28, it describes two very different young men. And in verse 24 it says, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Then in verse 27 it says this, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So as you look at this, you can see that Esau was a very rugged man, a man's man, you might say, who loved to hunt. And his dad loved him because of that. Jacob was more quiet. He stayed home. He liked to maybe cook and enjoyed hanging out with his mom in the tent. Jacob would be considered sissy, I guess, by a lot then or today. He's an example of really gender nonconformity in his preferences. However, no one questioned that Jacob was a male. In fact, he fathered 12 sons and a daughter, okay? So there was no question of that. But that's interesting. You see that biblical example even in Scripture. Dr. Mayer and Dr. Paul McHugh, which we mentioned in the last session, who is a distinguished service professor of psychiatry, again at Johns Hopkins, found in their extensive research on sexuality and gender that in the course of their development, many children explore the idea of being the opposite sex. Nearly all children ultimately identify with their biological sex. The notion that a 2-year-old, having expressed thoughts or behaviors identified with the opposite sex, can be labeled for life as transgender has absolutely no support in science. Indeed, it is iniquitous or evil to believe that all children who have gender atypical thoughts or behavior at some point in their development, particularly before puberty, should be encouraged to become transgender. You know, and that's what a statement that is, really.
You know, but in our culture where we live, gender activists are looking for children that may display gender non-conforming behavior so that they can develop them and exploit them into their agenda. And they start this pursuit in preschool. Joe Hurst wrote a book for 4-year-olds, and it's titled The Gender Fairy. This book tells children only you can know whether you're a boy or a girl. No one can tell you. And this is her hope, that some children will realize their true identity is not the gender they were assigned at birth and will choose to make a social transition to live as their true gender. Isn't that sad? But this is in preschool. That's 4-year-olds. But hey, have any of you, are y'all familiar with Blue's Clues? Okay, now this is a very friendly, mostly we thought safe thing for kids to watch. And what I want to say here is you can't take for granted that anything for preschoolers is okay to watch, because it can change from one season to the next season, one show to the next show. And here's what's going on with Blue's Clues.
Hey, Blue, look at all these families. Hi, families. It's time for a pride parade. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 mommies. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big hooray. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 daddies. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Come on, friends. Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. These Babas are non-binary. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Families marching 4 by 4, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 4 by 4, hurrah, hurrah. Trans members of this family all love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Come join the fun!
So this is what you get. And this is where we are in our culture today, and this is the indoctrination that is prevalent in the media. And I say prevalent, it certainly is. Parents who resist the activists that are pushing for gender transition, they don't allow their children to transition to the opposite gender again, are called transphobes. They get a name, or bigots. Parents whose children exhibit COGD, childhood onset gender dysphoria, need to be loving and stand firm and understand that there is a totally natural way to resolve their child's gender confusion. You say, what is that natural way? It's called puberty. Okay? In fact, 90%, statistics say that 90% of children who experience childhood onset gender dysphoria experience resolution if puberty is allowed to take its course. Glenn Stanton, who is a respected researcher in the field of sexuality and gender, writes, the push in culture today to embrace and affirm such children's wishes is founded more upon a political ideology than it is in careful science and experience. Gender transition therapists will often defend their position by stating that if puberty blockers are used and gender dysphoria persists, then sex reassignment surgery will be less traumatic. However, it's important that parents understand, and it's very important that they understand, that there is no long-term evidence to prove that puberty blockers are even safe. Oxford University's Center of Evidence-Based Medicine recently reviewed research into puberty-blocking drugs. Professor Carl Kinahan concluded that puberty blocking was an unregulated live experiment on children. There's strong evidence that the drugs negatively impact bone development. They also may affect height, organ development, and bodily shape. There's evidence that puberty blockers can result in decreased bone mineralization, meaning a higher risk of fractures, an increased risk of obesity, and testicular cancer in boys. The British Medical Journal published a letter in January 2019, just last year, where 3 doctors who argued that the use of puberty-blocking medication leaves a young person in developmental limbo without the benefits of pubertal hormones or secondary sex characteristics, which would tend to consolidate gender identity, and is likely to threaten the maturation of the adolescent mind or to affect their thinking, their brain. To halt the natural process of puberty is an intervention of momentous proportions with lifelong medical, psychological, and emotional implications. And this leads us to the second type of gender dysphoria, which is the most prevalent, I guess, among adolescents, and that is rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD. In recent years, many adolescents who have never before experienced any type of gender nonconformity have been experiencing what may be called ROGD, or rapid onset gender dysphoria. Abigail Shire states, historically, gender dysphoria afflicted a tiny sliver of the population, roughly 0.01%, and almost exclusively, listen to this, almost exclusively in boys. Before 2012, hey, that's just, 9 years ago? In fact, there was no scientific literature before 2012 on girls ages 11 to 21 ever having developed gender dysphoria at all. In the last decade, that's changed and dramatically. The Western world has seen a sudden surge of adolescents claiming to have gender dysphoria and self-identifying as transgender. For the first time in medical history, girls are not only present among those so identifying, they constitute now the majority. Why? What happened? She says. How did an age group that had always been the minority of those afflicted, adolescents, come to form the majority? Perhaps more significantly, why did the sex ratio flip from being overwhelmingly boys to being overwhelmingly girls? She explains between 2009 and 2017, the number of high schoolers who had contemplated suicide increased 25%. The number of teens diagnosed with clinical depression grew 37% between 2005 and 2014. And worst hit, experiencing depression at a rate 3 times that of boys, were teenage girls. When Jonathan Haidt was interviewed on the Joe Rogan podcast, he points out that the average rates of self-harm reflect the same spike, an increase of 62% since 2009 among teenage girls. 62%. He adds, among preteen girls aged 10 to 14, rates of self-harm are up 189% since 2010, nearly triple what they were only 6 years before. What happened? Podcast host Joe Rogan asked Hatt, he said, why the sudden spike in anxiety, depression, and self-harm? And his answer was social media. Social media was his instant reply. Kirk Schlosser states the iPhone was released in 2007. By 2018, a decade later, 95% of teens had access to a smartphone, and 45% reported being online almost continually. And I think we can look around and we can see that is true almost continually.
Okay, Helena is a 20-year-old woman. She identified first as non-binary. Then later on, she identified as a transgender man. That was from 2013 through 2018. And then in 2016, that's when she began the medical transition of taking testosterone and becoming a man. Then, 2 years later, she detransitioned. So she says she was an avid Tumblr user, and during the whole time that she thought she was trans. In retrospect, now this is what she says herself, someone that detransitioned, she can see the profound influence the social media platform had on her life and the development of her trans identity. And I'm going to quote her. She says, Tumblr, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all very popular with teens, host a wide array of visual tutorials and pictorial inspiration to self-harm, anorexia, that's thinspiration or thinspo, cutting, and suicide. Posting one's experiences, listen to this, with any of these afflictions offers the chance to win hundreds, even thousands of followers. Anorexia, cutting, and suicide have all spiked dramatically since the arrival of the smartphone. It gets you a lot more attention. These girls, these teens, they're hurting so badly that they're willing to harm themselves to get attention. Lisa Littman wrote an article on ROGD in adolescents and young adults. And finally, after a lot of intense controversy, she was able to get it published. And I'm going to quote from that. Adolescents experiencing ROGD tended to either belong to a group of friends in which multiple or even all members became transgender, and they all identified around the same time. She said, or they were immersed in social media, or both. She described this as social contagion. A peer group, and parents, you got to pay attention to this, either real or virtual. You may think you know all your kids' friends, but if they have virtual friends, they can also be greatly, greatly influenced. A peer group, either real or virtual, fosters the mutual belief that anxiety and unhappiness may be caused by being transgender, and that gender transition will provide the solution.
You know, we really see this verified through testimonies given by several young people who transitioned using hormones and surgeries that was shown back in May on Fox News. And I just want to play a couple clips just to show you this.
Here's a woman called Gracelyn Dinsky-Smith explaining what she went through after she went to her doctor to treat her disorder. Watch.
She didn't really go into what my gender dysphoria might have been stemming from. We only did a few sessions. They asked me, so why do you want to go on testosterone? And I said, well, being a woman just isn't working for me anymore. And they said, okay.
So that was that. You got your prescription for testosterone.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Just 4 months after she started testosterone, she says she was approved for a mastectomy, what's called top surgery, that she told us was traumatic.
I started to have a really disturbing sense that like a part of my body was missing, almost a ghost limb feeling about being like, there's something that should be there. And the feeling really surprised me, but it was really hard to deny.
And so she detransitioned by going off testosterone, and then went back to the clinic. And she says complained to the doctor that the process didn't follow the WPATH guidelines.
I can't believe that I transitioned and detransitioned, including hormones and surgery, in the course of like less than 1 year. It's completely crazy.
Another person who spoke to 60 Minutes, a man identified as Garrett, told Leslie Stahl that doctors rushed him into a sex change operation. After just 3 months of taking female hormones, they castrated him.
Garrett from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, went from taking hormones to getting his testicles removed, he says, in just 3 months, whereas the current guidelines call for continuous use for a year.
I had never really been suicidal before until I had my breast augmentation, and about a week afterwards, I wanted to actually kill myself. I had a plan and I was gonna do it, but I just kept thinking about my family to stop myself. it kind of felt like, how am I ever gonna feel normal again like other guys now?
3 months to castration, and then a week after the surgery, he wanted to kill himself.
And as we're seeing, there's a barrage of gender theory indoctrination that is from gender advocate doctors, social media, liberal media outlets, and certainly their peers. And unfortunately, even President Biden has become a spokesman for children as young as 8 years old to transition.
At what age do we have to respect their personal decision to, say, undergo chemical castration? Well, last year, Joe Biden answered that question. He suggested that children as young as 8 can change their sex.
The idea that an 8-year-old child or a 10-year-old child decides, I decided I want to be transgender. That's what I think I'd like to be. It'll make my life a lot easier. There should be zero discrimination.
As I listen and all this and study this stuff, it just breaks my heart. It's heartbreaking. But the transgender indoctrination propaganda doesn't end here. It certainly extends into the public education system. The public education system has also become a major proponent of advocating the LGBTQ plus agenda. In the chapter titled The Schools, in Abigail Shire's book, Irreversible Damage, she uncovers much of the abuse children are receiving regarding gender ideology in public schools. And Abigail Shire, let me just stop and say, does not claim to be a Christian. As far as I can tell, she has no claim of that. She's writing from a secular perspective. And she interviewed Judy Chason, who oversees all policy with regard to sexual orientation and gender identity education in 1,200 Los Angeles schools and over 600,000 students in those 1,200 schools. And she told Shire the role of schools has changed. Technically, we're an educational institution, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. Technically, that's what we are. But schools, she says, have expanded to be the hub for a lot more social services and looking more holistically, emotionally at what's going on with children, looking at schools as a source of social justice. Our role continues to expand. The outreach now is profound. Many of today's educators regard the gender and sexual identity education kids receive from their parents as hopelessly, let me just say, inadequate. They're stepping up to correct this omission from the parents, they say, in the public schools to drag American families into the 21st century. And LGBTQ students, she says, need to have teachers and parents who are very comfortable. Just go ahead and say the word gay. Say it out loud, in a very positive way. Dr. Kaysen says, talk about transgender, talk about gender diversity, talk about your transgender uncle. This needs to just be part of our daily conversation. That's what they need. And they need, when that happens, they need their parents to call the school and say, thank you. So what kind of instruction are the public school educators giving our K through 6 children?
Okay, in schools across America, kindergarten now, are taught that biological sex and gender a lot of times come apart. They are not congruent. One has no essential connection to the other. That's what they're being taught. And now this is how gender ideology is taught in schools. They use materials, they use curriculum, they use speakers, and they use teacher training that is all supplied by gender activists. Kindergartners are introduced to the genderbread person. Remember, we showed that earlier. And gender unicorn. They make it all very friendly. Kindergarten teachers read from I Am Jazz, and the little ones are taught that they might have a girl brain and a boy body. Or vice versa. So schools that administer this instruction, they never address or acknowledge anything as a scientific matter. It's gibberish. It's biologically nonsensical to suggest that a girl's brain, every cell of it stamped with XX, might inhabit a boy's body. It doesn't make sense. No mention is made of the fact that there are no diagnostic or empirical criteria for deciding that a biological girl is in fact really a boy. So they don't bring science or biology into this at all. So they're full of dogmatic insistence and gentle prodding. This is what they do with the kids. Where do you fit on the gender spectrum? How do you know? Are you sure? And in California, the Board of Education provides, and this is through virtual libraries, a book intended for kindergarten teachers to read to their students. The name of it is Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity. And it's by Brooke Pesson Wedby. And I'm going to read you what this says about this book. Who Are You offers kids a smorgasbord of gender options. There are just a few words people use. Trans, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral, agender, neutros, bigender, third gender, two-spirit. These are all in this book, or this Who Are You? In the book, Who Are You? Yes. The way baby boomers, this is what she says, this is Sharon, the way baby boomers once learned to rattle off state capitals, elementary school kids are now taught today's gender taxonomy, often enough to have it committed to memory. And while gender ideologues insist that they're merely presenting an objective ontology, it's hard to miss that they seem to hope that kids will pick up a fun, gender-creative option for themselves. And the last tenet of gender ideology that Who Are You presents is a child's feelings is the infallible indicator of gender. You are who you say you are because you know best. That's what the book preaches to the kids. And I just want to say, praise God for some Christian teachers that are still sticking it out in public education, that are there and they can deter some of these really radical ideology and resources. And I thank you. I know y'all have several in this church, and I thank God that they're there and they're not allowing things like this to reach the children.
How about middle school? Positive Prevention Plus is among the most highly respected health curricula to use in schools that employ gender identity instruction. This curriculum is designed for middle school students, instructs teachers to engage students in, and notice this, in imagining a different gender activity. This is what they have students do. Teachers are directed, ask students to stand up, turn around twice, and sit back down. Then say, I want each of you to imagine that you're a different gender. If the students fail to engage, a teacher should press them. Ask, what would be different in your life if you were a different gender? List students' responses on the board. Then ask, how would you feel to be another gender? How would it feel? What would be fun about being another gender? What things in your life would not change if you were another gender? The only rule is that sexual dimorphism, or two distinct biological sexes, male and female, they have to be rejected outright. You can't give that as an answer. Teachers present an array of gender and sexual identity options and appear pleasantly surprised when a child chooses wisely, that is, anything but cisgender. And a cisgender, again, is what we would consider normal male and female. The kid is certainly not encouraged to share the big news with her folks.
Now, what about in high school? Now, this is Abigail Schreier. She's reporting all these things. She says the high school versions of 3 of the most highly respected health curricula that include gender identity and sexual orientation instruction are so raunchy, explicit, and radical that I couldn't decide whether they were trying to excite adolescents to the point of orgasm or turn them off to sex entirely. And she continues, anal sex is promoted so often. This is in sex education in high school. It's promoted so often that one would assume the writers believed they had invented it. Fisting and anal stimulation by mouth are discussed in supplementary materials, leaving nothing to the imagination. No orifice is left behind. It encourages students to look constantly for landmark feelings or impulses, anything that might point toward gender fluid, genderqueer, asexual, or non-binary. And it encourages, get this, the subtle formation of two camps, us and them. It's intended to divide. Angela, a mom who sends her daughter to public school in Northern Virginia, was interviewed by Abigail Schreier, and this is what she said. She told me that all of her daughter's friends at school identify as transgender or lesbian or gay or bi. I feel like it's very important, this is the mom talking, it's very important to my daughter and to a lot of these kids who are caught up in this to be part of the LGBT umbrella. I don't think it really matters to them as much what they are in that umbrella, but they've got to be in that umbrella because it's become such a tribe of which they're proud of being members. You see, a lot of the kids, they just want to belong. They just want to be accepted. They want to be a part of something. And that's what's drawing them in.
You know, and peer pressure is enormous. And we might ask, how is all this justified? How can they justify this? Now, this is the way they justify it. Educators claim that all the sexual orientation and gender identity education is necessary to prevent the battery, harassment, and acute psychological distress of LGBTQ children. We're told that bullying is used as an excuse for thorough indoctrination in gender ideology and the insistence that transgender students must be affirmed or suffer a steep psychological toll. But we might ask, who is doing all the bullying? And Schreier goes on to say, and she answers it this way, the affirmation of trans-identified students is so essential to their welfare and safety, according to educators, that it is the policy of the National Education Association in many public schools, including those in California, New York, and New Jersey, that when a trans-identified student comes out at school, the parents are not to be informed. In cases where the student claims to have unsupportive parents, as we have seen, school administrators and staff even go so far as to conceal the student's newly announced identity from the parents, while serendipitously changing the child's name and pronouns on all school forms. It is because of a belief held to be self-evident by gender activists and their lackeys in the school system. Bullies are forever circling trans-identified students. They torment these kids whenever they fail to affirm them. They cruelly refuse to use these kids' new names and even sometimes reject the kids' transgender identities altogether. These bullies must be beaten back with every new LGBTQ policy and so much feeble instruction. They are the new barbarians outside the schoolyard gates that teachers are working so hard to fend off. Children's welfare, as defined by these activists, is not their priority. These bullies, who know next to nothing about gender theory or queer theory, are officious intermeddlers in school policy and teacher instruction. They aren't even embarrassed by their own ignorance. They really shouldn't be considered at all, except that America's backward laws insist on allowing the intrusion. These bullies, what is their name? They go by Mom and Dad. As we've seen, the transgender indoctrination leads to more and more physiological damage to the child. Most transgender therapists tell parents that if they don't affirm the child's gender, what will happen? Your child, you better affirm it or they'll probably commit suicide. Suicide risk goes way up. Therefore, these so-called gender therapists almost always suggest that the child receive puberty blockers, and they'll suggest that. They falsely tell parents that these puberty blockers are reversible. Okay? Their goal in using puberty blockers is to block the secondary sex characteristics in females, development of breast, onset of menstrual cycles, in males deepening the voice, increased body and facial hair, broadening of shoulders, etc., because these normal bodily developments would make eventual passing as the opposite sex more difficult if the child continues on the path to medical transition. Now, we've already highlighted the physical dangers of puberty blockers, but the risk from there increases if they continue. Studies show that when a kid is put on puberty blockers, almost 100% of them will do cross-sex hormones. They'll continue from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, When young girls stop puberty and go straight to cross-sex hormones, you absolutely guarantee that they will be infertile the rest of their life. Using cross-sex hormones, testosterone carries all kinds of risks such as endometrial and ovarian cancer and hysterectomy. Many young boys go through chemical castration and will never be able to have children. To go along with these horrific treatments, girls are instructed to bind their breast and to have transition surgeries. To put it bluntly, in my words, the LGBTQ indoctrination going on in public schools is nothing less than child abuse. The recommendation promotes the mutilation of a child's body. Not only does the transgender indoctrination lead to more physiological damage to the child, but let me just say it damages also the child spiritually. As stated, we're all created in the image of God. We're created as male and female to take dominion and be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth with image bearers who reflect the glory of a holy God. To say that we're not what God created us to be is to usurp God's authority over His creation and to play God ourselves. Even as it says in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 through 28, it says, "For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done." Gender ideology is an idolatrous philosophy that vainly attempts to fill the emptiness within a child or a teen or an adult with false identity that will lead them to even deeper and further despair. Even as it says in Proverbs 14:12, "There is a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof is death." To intentionally indoctrinate innocent children to look to fill their loneliness, their emptiness, by transitioning to another gender is horrific, and it's a whole affront to a holy God. These children are steered or pushed away from the truth that their need is a relationship with Jesus Christ. He alone is the answer to every desire of their heart. He alone is the answer to every desire of their heart. That's why Jesus said in Luke 4:18, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." In these first three sessions, I've tried to take a little bit of time, to have an understanding of God's divine design, an understanding of what gender ideology is, and also in this session, an understanding of how our children, the media, the schools, everything around us is trying to indoctrinate them into this. In this last session, a very important session, we're going to talk about how do we protect our children. And how do we speak the truth in love to those who are behind this movement? Or when you're confronted with someone who has gender dysphoria, how do we speak the truth in love? How do we engage with them? So